So in my first talk this morning, I told the stories of three half-remembered 19th and early 20th century evangelical women whose names just occasionally make it into the footnotes of the published histories of the period and whose stories could be reconstructed with care and effort from the scattered traces of primary source evidence that they left behind when they died. Now, my second talk this afternoon, as an illustration of the ways in which 19th century evangelical women can be misremembered in the way that we tell their stories, I'm going to focus on two stories of two women, a mother and a daughter who shared the same name, ironically, Mary Ann Thornton, so you'll have to, I'll try and distinguish them, but they have the same name. And I'm going to look at the way in which their stories were handed down to us by Mary Ann Thornton's great nephew, E.M. Forster. So hopefully there's a few people who love 19th century literature and 20th century literature who know some of these people I'm going to mention. So Mary Ann Jr., the subject of E.M. Forster's biography, she was born in 1797 and she was the eldest of 9 children. And her mother, Mary Ann Sr., so this is Mary Ann Sykes Thornton, she was the wife of Henry Thornton, who was William Wilberforce's second cousin, and together they played a key role in the Clapham sect, which was an influential network of early 19th century evangelicals. And just as an aside, there is a conference that's going to be organised through Moore College Library later this year about the Clapham connections with Australia. I know Ruth's nodding, she's going to be speaking about Hannah More. I'm going to be speaking a bit about the Thorntons, and there's lots of interesting connections. Yeah. So here we go, and this is where we can see at the very bottom, he's explained that his mother is Alice there. So that's the connection between E.M. Forster and members of the Clapham sect. And here are some of the people we're going to be talking about. So E.M. Forster was the writer of her biography. And he was the early 20th century novelist who wrote classics like Howard's End, A Room with a View, and A Passage to India. Now, if you grew up in the right generation, like me, you might also be familiar with the beautiful film adaptations of them that were made in the 80s and 90s by Ismail Merchant and James Ivory. Got a couple of the cover art there. Pictures there. So Forster wrote the story of his great aunt Mary Ann's life, publishing it in 1956 and calling it a domestic biography. It contains much that is deeply personal to both Forster and his subject, but its scope is not merely private. Forster's biography of his great aunt is interesting for its own sake as a beautiful piece of writing and a glimpse into the life of a really interesting woman. But it's also interesting as a subset of the larger relationship between the Bloomsbury set or Bloomsbury group to which Forster was connected and the Clapham sect with which Mary Ann Thornton was intimately involved. The Bloomsbury sect and the Clapham sect were two of the most influential circles of colleagues and friends in modern English history. No account of the cultural history of England in the 19th and 20th centuries can be complete without a discussion of each of these two groups and of the complicated, multi-layered relationship between them. So the Clapham sect is the name given to a network of evangelical friends in the late 18th and early 19th centuries who shared a common set of religious convictions and moral values and were involved together in the promotion of a string of high-profile political and social causes. The name Clapham sect reflects the fact that many of the members had lived right near each other in Clapham, right in London, with the Clapham Common in the middle, and they were living in a cluster of dwellings that centred on the home of Henry and Mary Ann Thornton. Their house was Battersea Rise, pictured there, and they all attended the church at Holy Trinity Clapham. And through their individual and joint endeavours, the group members were major contributors to the abolition of the slave trade, founders of the British colony of Sierra Leone, architects and patrons of the Sunday school movement, and prominent supporters of Christian mission. Their members included people like William Wilberforce, Henry Thornton, Zachary Macaulay, James Stephen, Hannah More, John Venn, who was the rector there, Thomas Babington. I could go on, but they were a tight-knit, famous group of people who had the same interests in terms of social activism and their faith. Now, in many ways, the group revolved around the work and charismatic personality of William Wilberforce. He was their leader in private as well as in public, adored by the members of the group, even inspiring poems that were passed around among the group's members. But even more than the charisma of Wilberforce, it was the shared religious convictions of the group members that united them with one another. The ethos of the Clapham sect was defined both by the doctrinal content of those beliefs and by their outworking in the group members' affections and their conduct, what they termed true religion. The common life of their community was, according to Henry Thornton, an opportunity to, quote, elevated piety without affectation and without extravagance. And to do this for a public that had been given too many reasons to look askance at the excesses and hypocrisies of the evangelical party. Like the Clapham sect, the name of the Bloomsbury set was given to a London-based group of friends with shared values and ideals. Many of them lived within a small area of London, in their case Bloomsbury, and their social gatherings were centred in their homes. While many of the friendships had been formed earlier at Cambridge, Bloomsbury was where the group continued to congregate in the years after they went down from university. The group's boundaries were loose and fluid, but key names included Vanessa, Virginia, Toby, and Adrian Stephen, and Vanessa became Vanessa Bell, and Virginia Woolf, who's probably more familiar to many of us. Also John Maynard Keynes, Lytton Strachey, Duncan Grant, and Leonard Woolf, as well as E.M. Forster, Trevelyan, and James Strachey. Some of those names might be familiar, who knows? Now, the origins of the group can be traced back to the very end of the 19th century. And really, people look to Toby Stephen, who was the son of Leslie Stephen. He went up to Cambridge in 1899. He befriended a number of others at Trinity College, and they became members of a secret conversation society called the Cambridge Apostles. At the end of his studies, he returned home, and it was soon after that his father died in 1905, and that meant that the four Stephen's children, Virginia, Vanessa, Toby and Adrian, were on their own, and they moved from the family house in Kensington to the less fashionable neighbourhood of Bloomsbury. And others in their group of friends were drawn to Bloomsbury, and the group shared their homes informally and also congregated and organised meetings together. They had organised meetings that mirrored the Apostles' meetings in Cambridge, where they discussed actual books and ideas. They did that every Thursday night, but they spent a lot of time in each other's homes as well. And so here's a picture of the four children as children, but by this stage they were older and they were working out what they believed, as we'll see. This is just a picture of one of the squares that they lived in Bloomsbury. Okay. Now, the relationship between the Bloomsbury set and the Clapham sect was a multi-layered one. At one level, there were obvious similarities between the two groups. As Gertrude Himmelfarb puts it, Bloomsbury was, in fact, as much a group or circle as Clapham was a sect. And it performed the same function, setting the tone and agenda for the cultural vanguard of the nation. But underneath the similarities in form and function between the two groups was a sharp antithesis in beliefs and purpose. Close to the heart of what the members of the Bloomsbury set had in common with one another was a liberation from Clapham itself and those vestiges of evangelicalism and Victorianism that still persisted in the early 20th century. Bloomsbury's relationship with Clapham was also as much genealogical as it was antithetical. And in his book, The Dons, Mentors, Eccentrics and Geniuses, Noel Annan sets out a fascinating set of genealogies which displays how much of the Bloomsbury set were descendants of the Clapham sect. And there's about 10 pages worth of these genealogies that show very close connections between these Clapham sect families and the Bloomsbury great-grandchildren or grandchildren. So here's a couple of examples. There's in the Bloomsbury group, there was Trevelyan and Zachary Macaulay, one of the key Clapham sect members, was his grandfather. And there's this story actually where they do say, well, who is Zachary Macaulay to each other in the Bloomsbury group? And they say, oh, it's Trevelyan's grandfather, sort of forgetting, what a huge impact he'd had historically. Yes, there's also Huxleys and other names as well in there. And then another one I was going to show you was this one, which is relevant to the Wolfe family as well, or Virginia Woolf and the Stephen family. So James Stephen was a member of the Clapham sect. His son Leslie Stephen, we can see in the circle, was then the father of the Stephen children who I just mentioned, and Virginia Woolf. And so they became the centre of Bloomsbury. Also, as an aside, there were quite a few Stephens from this family that came to Australia too, and played it, sort of became a legal dynasty. So there were genealogical connections, and already by the time of the Bloomsbury group emerging, most members of these families of Clapham members had really experienced a successive diminution of religious faith, as Gertrude Himmelfarb puts it. That had really sort of happened across the second half of the 19th century. So with each generation, there'd been a bit of a loss of that faith and zeal of the Clapham generation. In their new home in Bloomsbury, the Stephen siblings found they could reevaluate the traditions, routines and values that they had received from their parents. Virginia Woolf, just Virginia Stephen at the time, had a sense of the significance of this move when she reflected that everything was going to be new, everything was going to be different, everything was on trial. Strictly speaking, as Himmelfarb argues, it was the late Victorian era that was the most direct target of the Bloomsbury group's rebellion. And in that era, as I said, many of the original convictions of the Clapham era had already been lost. The parents of Bloomsbury had already abandoned conventional religion on the whole. They retained some of its philanthropic vestiges, but had kind of converted them into a secular moral science. Their moral properties had become a surrogate for religious proprieties. Nevertheless, it would still be a mistake to think that the contempt of the Bloomsbury set was reserved exclusively for the diluted residue of Victorian beliefs and morals that they had received from their parents. Their criticisms were directed not only at their parents' generation, but also more broadly at the culture of Victorianism as a whole. The scope of this rejection can be readily seen in the most famous attack on the Victorian era from a member of Bloomsbury, Lytton Strachey's Eminent Victorians. And if you ever get a chance to read it, it's very scathing about those family members. But given that most of the group had been brought up in the Victorian era, to reject Victorianism was for them, according to Himmelfarb again, to mutilate one's family, one's memories, one's self. The ethics that they adopted derived from the philosophy of G.E. Moore, as it was expressed in his Principia Ethica, published in 1903. His book was received enthusiastically by Bloomsbury members. For them, Moore's book represented a release from the old morality. He argued that the fundamental moral truth involved in states of consciousness, the highest of them of which were the pleasures of human intercourse and the enjoyment of beautiful objects. So that really sums it up. The pleasures of human intercourse and the enjoyment of beautiful objects. That became their shared philosophy. So they're deeply influenced by his vision. And it involved a commitment to personal affections, aesthetic enjoyments, a liberation from the whole idea of morality as a sanctioning code. The repudiation of morality led to, or functioned as a rationalisation of, a complicated and messy set of relationships within the group. The matrix of their sexual relations with each other has been well documented, actually. This is just one picture I found. There are quite a few others that try and do diagrams of the marriages and affairs and all sorts of relationships. And as, again, Himmelfarb puts it, I do recommend you read Himmelfarb, she's great. She says, the wit who described Bloomsbury as a place where all the couples were triangles and lived in squares did not do justice to them. Some more polygonal figure would be required to describe those couples. So it's quite messy in terms of how they were living. And given that, their lives were experiments in living out this new system of values, it's also not surprising that the group spent a great deal of time writing about themselves. And they actually started a memoir club where they met once a week, and they ran for 2 decades, where they'd come and they'd read sections of their memoirs to each other, reflecting on childhood memories and experiences of interpersonal relationships. The portrait of it there. So this is just, a bit of a background to understanding E.M. Foster and where he's coming from when he writes this biography. So E.M. Foster was part of the Bloomsbury group, but by most accounts was not really at the centre of it and drifted in and out of its orbit. In the memoir of his aunt, interestingly, Forster has a distinctly more tolerant tone than that of Strachey and others such as Virginia Woolf. But while taking a gentler approach, Forster did share the same core values of Bloomsbury. He repudiated religion and traditional morality, placed a high value on aesthetics, and along with a number of other members of the Bloomsbury set, had complicated views on gender and sexuality. Forster was raised within the Church of England, being taken to church each week by his mother, when the mud was not too bad, he said. But he rejected Christianity completely soon after arriving at Cambridge. And he said later he lost his faith with comparatively little fuss. That had happened long before he was writing Mary Ann Thornton. And it was really influenced by friends who were atheists and also More's ethics as well. Aesthetics were also a big deal for Forster. Closely tied to his views on religion were those views on aestheticism. So it's been said by scholars such as Wilfred Stone that this was his religion. His art and his belief in art are his religion. Forster's criticism of the Clapham sect was in no small part an aesthetic one. In his opinion, they had no interest in art or literature unless it was of an intellectual or formative character. Their great defect, he asserted, was indifference to the unseen. It came out in everything. The books they collected, in the letters my great aunts wrote to one another, and in the comments which they made upon life, which are surprisingly dry for people so pious. Poetry, mystery, passion, ecstasy, music don't count. And the reason why the members of the Clapham sect were unable to appreciate the unseen, according to Forster, was their wealth and commercial origins, its commercial origins. So his great-grandfather, Forster suggests in his essay, Henry Thornton, had 2 claims on the notice of posterity: an essay on paper credit and a volume of family prayers. And he said a juxtaposition that not too subtly implies, quote, unholy union of commerce and piety. Forster's contempt for the materialism of the Thorntons and their circle can be seen throughout his essay. Even though they gave much of their wealth away, he argued, quote, wealth always fashions the person who swallows it, no matter how promptly he purges. While Thornton, Forster admits, played a part in the campaign to end the slave trade, which was a great work, this work needs, in his words, needs doing all over again to rid the world of the evils of commercialism to which the Thorntons had contributed. Forster's attitudes to women are also relevant when we're looking at this book, and they're quite difficult to gauge. His life and writings show paradoxes and contradictions. And that, I think, goes some way towards explaining the complexities and tensions that can be found within Marianne Thornton, as I'll go on to highlight in the talk. Forster himself acknowledged a certain level of ignorance about women in his early years. And in 1904, one of his resolutions was to get a less superficial idea about women. But in many ways, some of his contemporaries actually commented on some of his misogynistic tendencies, including Virginia Woolf, who criticised him for them. And another factor to consider in relation to Forster's attitudes to women is his complicated relationship with his mother. He was an only child. His father died when he was very young, and he's often quoted as saying he felt quite smothered by her for most of his life, and his Bloomsbury friends encouraged him in that perspective. Virginia Woolf once describing her as his old, fussy, exacting mother. But coexisting with this frustration was a certain mutual dependence between Forster and his mother. Despite his feelings of suffocation, he loved her, and he felt he couldn't even be frank or honest with her because he feared her disapproval or pity. In her old age, his attitude towards her did somewhat soften, and he wrote to a friend in 1938 that he acknowledged that whilst his mother had cramped and warped his genius, he still had to admit that she provided a sort of rich subsoil that somehow contributed, despite everything, to his flourishing. So hopefully getting a little bit of an idea for the tone of his work. Okay, well, here's a picture with his mother too, which it's a bit blurry, but it's reproduced in the book. Now, Forster writes in the preface to Marianne Thornton that the book is based almost entirely upon family papers. Now, the papers are, or the Thornton papers, are the letters, diaries, photographs and pictures that were passed down from generation to generation within the Thornton family. Now kept at the University Library at Cambridge, the documents had originally been bequeathed to E.M. Forster, and he was given the task of preserving them after his mother's death in 1945. The sources sometimes suggest some of them were even passed down earlier than that. And in scrawly handwriting at the beginning of Marianne Thornton's own book recollections, she bequeaths them to Edward Morgan Foster from his great aunt Marianne Thornton. When Forster inherited them after his mother's death, there was an abundance of paper stuffed in ancient willow baskets, including letters and bound books of family accounts going back to Henry Thornton. Forster destroyed a great many of them, burning them on a bonfire and keeping a record of what he destroyed. Forster's attitude to the papers appears to have been closely connected to his attitudes towards the women in his life. He described the works that he destroyed as 150 years of letters, mostly from women to women, and hundreds of letters in which one woman writes to another about the ill health of a third. It was women too who had curated the collection, that was handed down to him, and with the result that the files had fallen into his possession, had been, in his words, tidied up by pious editrices. But Forster himself was not averse to doing his own tidying up of the papers that he'd received. Those papers he didn't destroy, he would frequently mutilate or abridge. Thus, for example, in Marianne's account, I think I have it later actually, I'll show it to you later, of parents' deaths, he actually cut 10 pages out from the end of that book. And he would frequently use the remaining pages in a document for his own work, and sometimes really as a deliberate act of desecration. After he'd torn pages out of his Aunt Laura's diary, for example, he wrote, "Aunt Laura kept this book locked up and felt it to be sacred. I shall use up the unfilled pages." Now, in the remainder of this talk, as a case study in the complexities of how the Bloomsbury generation remembered their evangelical forebears, I want to zero in on the similarities and differences between the portrayals of the two Mariannes who appear within the work. Marianne Thornton, herself the book's principal subject, and Marianne Sykes Thornton, her mother. while the former Marianne Jr. is portrayed by Foster in a way that accentuates those aspects of the past in which he sees something of himself, the latter, Marianne Sr., is represented, to the extent she's permitted a voice and presence at all, as a figure of the dead, repudiated past. She lurks in the shadows of the book, pushed to the margins as an archetypal Victorian or pre-Victorian mother who symbolises everything about motherhood and Victorianism that Forster wished to distinguish himself from. So on the left, that is Marianne Jr., even though she's older when she had a portrait done, and that's Marianne Sykes Thornton, married to Henry Thornton, on the right. We'll start with Marianne Jr. So E.M. Foster, as Christopher Tolley puts it, was a questionable biographer for his great aunt. His attitude toward the subject of the biography was shot through with strong, mutually contradictory impulses. The main contradiction that shapes his portrayal of his great aunt Marianne is the conflict between the sense of personal attachment and indebtedness that he felt towards her and disdain that he felt for the ethos and beliefs of the family to which she belonged. Throughout the book, Foster repeatedly attempts to distance Marianne from the rest of the family by suggesting that she was in some way different from the rest of the Thorntons and the Clapham sect. In a section of the book where he criticises her father, Henry Thornton, for a lack of imagination, for example, Marianne is initially included in this criticism. He says, "For Marianne, as for her father, the terrestrial world became entirely tangible, and behind it, equally reliable in another and superior way, stood God. For her, as for him, imagination is dangerous because it makes us behave in an unreal way to people which may hurt them." Now, an earlier draft of Marianne Thornton had actually included an anecdote illustrating and confirming that judgment. He'd said, this is something that wasn't published, Marianne learnt her lesson in the end. As an old lady, she embodied downright common sense. She could not abide Alice in Wonderland, but it's a dream, Moni, that was their nickname for her. Her nieces would say pleadingly, "Yes, my dear, I know it's a dream, and a very silly one. I too have dreams, but I am not so foolish as to write them down." Now, as I said, this was edited out of the final version, and instead the reader is assured that she had a wider outlook than Henry's and his, and more external warmth. She was fonder of fun and even loved nonsense, and she allowed considerable liberty to imagination's henchman, fancy. So he's gone out of his way to sort of distance her from Henry and the rest in his final version. Forster later takes a similar approach to her religious views. While initially admitting they were the same as her parents, he then presents a softer version. He says, what she cared for was the Christian life, rooted in the family and flowering in action. The example of Christ was present in her prayers, but for practical purposes, there was a convenient exemplar in her parents. She did not imitate them idolatrously. The world was moving and she with it. And she abandoned their elaborate examinations of self and others and adopted a lighter psychological touch. When describing Marianne's involvement in educational causes, similarly, he begins by describing her educational philosophy as being derived from Hannah More and her parents, but goes on to say that her motivations were much closer to his humanist ideals. First and foremost, her dislike of ignorance and her 18th century faith in reason. Further on, he discusses a series of reading booklets for children that she wrote, and he explicitly distances her from the Clapham sect's ideals of education, saying, in form and sometimes sentiments, she was indebted to Hannah More, but she had a lighter touch and sketched rather than underlined her religious and moral conclusions. And he again attempts to depict her as a humanist, motivated by faith in human nature. Which, interestingly, if you Google her now, it comes up at Wikipedia that she's a humanist, which is very interesting, I think. So that has had implications. A good deal of Forster's softening of his great aunt's image stems from a respect or loyalty to his aunt. While he was born too late to get to know her well, he did have a first-hand connection with her and had memories of sitting on the edge of her bed, dipping bread into soft-boiled eggs. She wrote him letters that he retained and added to the existing collection of Thornton papers. His affection for her can be seen in how he reproduces these letters, which he says, which show her at her best at the end of the book, with warm and positive comments connecting them. As he neared the end of his own life, he was increasingly aware of how he was indebted to her, as it was her legacy of £8,000 that made it possible for him to go to Cambridge and become a writer. He said, "I'm thankful to Marianne Thornton, for she and no one else made my career as a writer possible, and her love, in a most tangible sense, followed me beyond the grave." So it's understandable that he has feelings of thankfulness to her. But at another level, it's been suggested that in many ways it was actually his own life that he was reflecting on. Philip Furbank suggests that as Forster read the papers, he was impressed with his Aunt Marianne, and this led to him to speculate about her influence on him. As well as the inheritance from her, Forster also began to see a somewhat egocentric spiritual aspect to the story of her role in his emergence. Quote, "There was a theme here, how through Aunt Moni's love and hopes for him, so Philistine a family as the Thorntons should in the end have produced an artist." So there's a lot of introspection happening too when he talks about Marianne Jr. Now, moving on to Marianne Sykes Thornton. So the first thing to be said about Forster's portrayal of Marianne's mother, Marianne Sykes Thornton, is how little there is of it. Even though this is by Forster's choice a domestic biography, it contains far more about Marianne's father, Henry Thornton, than it does about his wife. A telling example of the way in which Marianne Sykes Thornton is pushed aside into the shadows can be seen in the scant amount of space Forster devotes to the story of her death, compared to the voluminous accounts of it that were bequeathed to him within the Thornton papers. So the fact I've looked at the papers, I know that it's there. It's not that he just didn't have it. And despite his deep frustration with the amount of material that Marianne wrote about her parents' death, contained in a document that he disdainfully labels the pronouncement, Forster still devotes 3 pages within the chapter to the details and descriptions of Henry Thornton's death. When it comes to Marianne Sykes Thornton's death, however, he skips over the detail almost completely and says, "The pronouncement proceeds through the minutiae of grief and burial and then describes in equal detail the illness and death of her mother. I shall give no account of that or the many other deathbeds which will line this professional way. Henry Thornton's is a sufficient epitome of them." So she doesn't get much mention there. The motive behind this decision does not appear to have been merely a desire to be economical with words. An examination of the source itself reveals that 10 pages have been cut from Marianne's recollections of her parents' deaths, just as at the point where she was about to describe her mother's death. It was not enough for him to let the account of Henry's death serve as a sufficient epitome of the others. The account of his wife's death needed to be physically cut out of the record and dispensed with. Another way in which Marianne Sykes Thornton's role is minimised in Marianne Thornton is in relation to the parenting of Marianne Jr. Now, this is one area in which Forster is capable of being relatively positive about the Thorntons, highlighting those aspects of family life that he says reflected the Enlightenment of the 18th century rather than the stuffiness of the 19th. In Forster's account, the enlightened 18th century aspects of the household ethos, though, were associated with Marianne's father, not her mother. His description of the way in which the Thorntons educated their children includes a lengthy extract from Marianne's recollections, in which she describes in detail Henry Thornton's thoughts on education, focusing mainly on the work that she did with her father as his secretary. Later, he quotes extensively from a portion of Henry Thornton's diary in which he reflects on how similar Marianne Jr. is to him. According to the primary source material in the Thornton papers, however, Marianne's education involved much more than the part that her father played, and her mother was intimately involved in it. Marianne Sykes Thornton shared her husband's views on educating children and took responsibility for a significant amount of it herself. Her friends had written formative books on education in the late 18th century, including Thomas Gisborne's An Inquiry into the Duties of the Female Sex, pictured there, and Hannah More's Strictures on the Modern System of Female Education, also pictured. And these influenced Marianne and her husband. And she'd read and commented on Hannah More's book even before it had gone to the printers. Marianne Sykes Thornton was actively involved in the application of these details and these ideals in relation to her daughter's education. She taught Marianne how to read and write from a very young age. Marianne also taught her arithmetic and basic accounting, and her mother organised for the Morning Chronicle to be read to her every day while they had breakfast. In line with the somewhat unconventional views of her mother, Marianne Jr. Also had part of her education which involved practical things like churning the butter before breakfast every morning that a nursery maid would normally have done. When Forster does make mention of Marianne Sykes Thornton in relation to education, his tone is dismissive and patronising, best summed up in his comment that it is difficult to estimate her character, for it soon resembled her husband's. She became Moon to his son. Foster's depiction of the Thorntons' marriage is influenced by his broader views about heterosexual marriage in general and 19th century marriage in particular. Thus, for example, he describes the marriage proposal from Henry as something that could, quote, best understood by readers who tolerate an outmoded approach to love. He acknowledges the fact that, according to the evidence that survives in the Thornton papers, the happiness of the marriage between Henry and Marianne cannot be doubted, but immediately follows this with a statement that any evidence of happiness may have been removed by those pious editresses who preceded him. While Foster briefly includes a romantic snippet from a letter from Henry to Marianne, he again refuses to give her a voice at all, and there's no indication of her feelings for her husband. She is, after all, merely the Moon. Foster's depiction of Marianne Sykes Thornton shows similarities to other archetypal mothers in Foster's fiction. The closest parallel is with Ruth Wilcox in Howard's End, who is portrayed by Forster as the perfect wife. He judges her according to the conventional mores that were the consistent target of Forster's gentle ridicule. In representing Marianne Sykes Thornton as a conventional, passive and uninteresting wife, Forster is placing her squarely within the typology that he constructs within his fiction. In order to do so, however, it is necessary for him, consciously or unconsciously, to exclude a wealth of evidence within the Thornton papers that would suggest a very different picture. Far from merging her personality with her husband's, as Foster suggests, Marianne set out quite deliberately to do the opposite. She was conscious that while she wished to have him near, she would need to encourage him to spend time away from Battersea Rise to fulfil his political responsibilities. In a letter to Hannah More that she wrote in 1797, for example, Marianne's quite explicit about her desire to become a more independent being and her efforts to encourage her husband, during the weeks when Parliament was sitting, to dine at least 4 days a week with Mr. Wilberforce in Palace Yard. Forster's view also discounts the overwhelming evidence that Marianne Sykes Thornton herself was integral to the group and its activities. James Stephen, for example, one of the other Clapham members, described Marianne's role at Battersea Rise as, quote, a matronly presence, controlling, animating, harmonising the elements of this world by a kindly spell. Her daughter, Marianne Jr., went even further than this, describing her parents not as master and mistress, but as the two masters. We get a glimpse of Marianne Sr.'s attitude to her husband's work in a letter that she wrote to her sister-in-law, Mrs. Robert Thornton. And she wrote from Brighton, where she and Henry were enjoying a break. And she described the routine that they had there of taking a book with them down to the beach, bathing there and strolling about. And she says, this is what Henry called a very idle life, and I think it is quite a holiday because I see so much of him. But we both agree that this is only a preparation for harder duty when we return to the field of action. Marianne's partnership with her husband was not limited to her efforts to encourage him in his endeavours and provide a venue for the Clapham sect to discuss their politics. She was often part of those conversations and loved what she called a discuss. The letters between Marianne and Henry suggest that they frequently discussed politics together, and he relied on her advice. A letter to Hannah More that she wrote in 1810 gives us another glimpse of their relationship. I seldom sleep till Mr. T returns for the house, and he comes to me not sleepy and fagged, but animated and hungry, and likes to bring up his coffee up to my room, talk over the debate, and repeat parts of the finest speeches. In contrast, she despaired of the superficiality of most women's conversations. In 1808, she recommended to Hannah More an article in the Christian Observer that criticised women's limited interests and narrow conversation topics. It's even been suggested that she may have had a hand in writing that article. As Henry's wife, she believed that she was called into public life as well. In her view, as she put it in a letter to her sister-in-law, this world is intended for active duties. One of the more complicated public philanthropic endeavours that she undertook was the establishment of a school for girls who'd been brought to England from Sierra Leone, and the personal involvement that she took in the girls' education. On another occasion, when pregnant with her second child in 1798, she organised and presided over an enormous feast for poor women and children in Lambeth, which involved the Thames being half covered with boats. Following the loss of her second baby, she came up with the idea of opening a dry nurse seminary. That was motivated by her interest and her increased awareness of wet nurses' need to leave their own babies in order to feed the babies of the rich. And from her research into the plight of wet nurses and babies, she discovered that the vast majority of the wet nurses' own children died as a result of being left by them. While her activities fell squarely within the bounds of what was deemed appropriate for upper middle class women of the time, Foster's depiction of her as nothing more than a pale reflection of her husband shows a deep misunderstanding of her character and the way in which she understood her marriage and her various social roles. The distorting effect of Forster's prejudices and assumptions in his portrayal of Marianne Sr. is not confined to the places where he presents her as a conventionally passive and compliant wife. He also goes out of his way to present her as weak and needy. One example of this is in his brief description of her death. He says, Mrs. Thornton died of grief. That is to say, grief weakened her, and she developed a husband's disease. Her end was less exemplary, for she worried about money. He goes on to describe some of the details of her worry, which included who to choose as guardians of her 9 children, and concluding, distracted with such problems, moving constantly between worldliness and piety and resting in neither, the sick woman wore her life away. Now, this account distorts the truth in several ways. I'm sure you're already thinking there are some problems with this. It's clear from the papers, though, that Marianne had actually been sick with the same illness as her husband for years before her husband died. It could have been even 13 years. So her sickness was hardly something that came upon her as a consequence of an emotional collapse in the wake of her husband's death. And while it is unsurprisingly true that she was affected by grief, Foster's description of the nature of the grief and the way it was expressed conveys an impression that's the opposite of the one that emerges from the evidence of the Thornton papers. Her daughter, for example, recalled that at the funeral, Marianne Sr. was wonderfully calm and composed, as William Wilberforce said, an image of dignified and yet submissive sorrow. The concern expressed by her close friend, Hannah More, was not that she was grieving inordinately or excessively, but that she was not allowing herself to express her grief enough. She said, "I'm afraid you will think me but a worldly counsellor when I say I wish you not too much to restrain your tears or to labour to suppress emotions which nature dictates and which grace does not forbid." That's a really beautiful letter, one of the ones I mentioned. An even more striking distortion in Forster's account is the adverse comparison that he makes between Marianne's death and her husband's, including his assertion that because she died tormented by worries about money, her death was not as exemplary as Henry's. Now, this is an extraordinary conclusion for him to have drawn and flies in the face of the evidence that was available to Foster in the Thornton papers. On the one hand, as far as Henry is concerned, it is clear from the surviving accounts that he himself was much occupied with worries about money during the final weeks of his life. On the other hand, in Marianne's case, her daughter mentions only once that her mother wrote to Zachary Macaulay about her annuity. She wished to make it for 10 years only, as she was sure that her departure was at hand. And that the day before she died, she signed a will which would terminate all her concerns with the world. So those are the two mentions of her concerns. Moreover, if Marianne Sr. was worried about the financial affairs of the family, her worries were not entirely without foundation. Wilberforce himself found that Henry Thornton's will was strangely ill-managed and not corrected, exposing the family to a serious risk that they would need to leave Battersea Rise. And it was Wilberforce and Dan Sykes, another family member, and James Stephen and John Thornton who called an emergency meeting and ensured that Marianne Sr. would be granted an annuity of £1,500 for life. Without this, she would have, in Wilberforce's words, been quite poor. So Forster's depiction of Marianne Sr. as a woman who died distracted and tormented by worries differs markedly from the first-hand accounts that were written at the time by her daughter and others who were present. Marianne Jr. told her friend Patty Smith that her mother, quote, had told them she was going home and was very comfortable. Wilberforce went as far as to assert that, quote, never was there a deathbed of greater tranquility, reassuring Hannah More that even Marianne herself, whose hand was in her mother's at the moment of departure, could not ascertain the moment when her soul quitted its earthly tenement. All things considered, Forster's consistent tendency when dealing with the mountain of material about Marianne Sr. that was included in the papers that her daughter had bequeathed to him was to marginalise and exclude her, or to the extent to which she appears at all, to recast her in accordance with the caricatures generated by his own prejudice. In October 1887, a week before she died, Marianne Jr. wrote her sister-in-law a letter asking for some milk. There's no evidence to suggest that the letter, which has since been lost, was anything remarkable in itself. But the fact that it was written after 35 years of painful alienation between Marianne and her sister-in-law Emily, it's a whole other story, that was understood to be, I suppose, something momentous, proof that, quote, the long state of estrangement between our houses should have passed away at last. For E.M. Forster, who recounts the episode in the closing pages of his great aunt's biography, the episode is charged with an even greater significance. Marianne is writing not to a person, but to a place, he says. The milk was a sacrament. She knew she was dying, and before it happened, she wished to be in physical touch with Battersea Rise. Now, regardless of whether Forster is correct in his interpretation of his great aunt's intentions, there's no doubting the importance that the anecdote had as a representation of his own understanding. For Forster, connection was everything, a view most famously expressed in the epigraph that he wrote on the title page of Howard's End, "Only connect." A similar maxim could be applied, I think, to the work of the biographer. The best biographies are not merely an objective, disinterested accumulation of facts assembled from the shards of evidence left behind by the past. What makes biography meaningful, in part at least, is the connections that exist between the past and the present, and between the biographer, the subject of his or her research, and the readers for whom the biography is written. Forster's famous epigraph in Howard's End, "Only Connect," is drawn from within the novel itself, where it serves as the text for the sermon that the newly married Margaret Schlegel, played by Emma Thompson in the movie version, attempts to preach to her husband, Henry. It says, "Margaret greeted her lord with peculiar tenderness on the morrow. Mature as she was, she might yet be able to help him to the building of the rainbow bridge that should connect the prose in us with the passion. Only connect." That was the whole of her sermon. In the end, however, despite Margaret's high hopes, her sermon fails. There was one quality in Henry for which she was never prepared, however much she reminded herself of it: his obtuseness. He simply did not notice things, and there was no more to be said. He never noticed that Helen and Frida were hostile, or that Tibby was not interested in currant plantations. He never noticed that the lights and shades that exist in the greyest conversation, the finger posts, the milestones, the collisions, the illimitable views. Ironically, in E.M. Forster's case, his attempt to tell the story of his great aunt and her family fails to do them justice for the same reason. There is simply too much that he does not notice or chooses not to pay attention to. His depiction of Marianne Jr. is affected at crucial points by the way in which he consciously or unconsciously projects himself onto his subject and remakes her in his own image. If anything, it could be said he overconnects with his subject. And his depiction of her mother, Marianne, is pervasively distorted by his failure to connect with her at all. Instead of seeing her in her uniqueness and humanity and permitting her a voice of her own, he silences her almost completely and imposes on her stereotypes and caricatures of his own prejudgments. Now, the idea that we could write biography without prejudgments or commitments of our own, of course, is a fantasy. But if our biographies are to tell the truth, or at least as close an approximation to it as we're capable of, then a crucial dimension of the biographer's task is to bring the past with all its strangeness into authentic connection with our present. Both the temptation to project ourselves onto our subjects and the temptation to react against their difference by pushing them away from us into the realm of caricature and generalisation must be resisted. For the evangelical historian or biographer seeking to understand the movement to which he or she belongs, there are at least two key elements of that task which a close study of Marianne Thornton serves to highlight. First, and most obviously, it is a reminder of the difficult and important work of retrieving the humanity of the evangelical past, bringing us into authentic contact with the unique, imperfect humanness of our forebears in a way that helpfully dispels and complicates the oversimplifications of both caricature and hagiography. Secondly, it's a reminder of the need to understand the humanity of the post-evangelical interpreter, in this case, E.M. Forster, including both the elements that are representative or typical of the time in which we live and the elements that are unique and peculiar. Margaret Schlegel may have been naive about the ease with which she imagined that a bridge of that sort could be constructed, but she was right about the indispensability of the task. If our work as biographers or writers or historians does nothing else but help us and our readers to notice things, the lights and shades that exist in the greyest conversation, the finger posts, the milestones, the collisions, the illimitable views, then it has accomplished something of enormous value.